Under the flickering lights of Pine Ridge Hospital, Dr. James Carter stumbled upon a sight that froze his blood. A tiny bobcat kitten, eyes glowing like embers, staring at the doors as if waiting for a ghost. Was it guarding a secret buried in the snow? Or had someone tried to silence it with a bullet that stained the frost red? Each night it returned, defying death and hunters, until one gunshot changed everything. Hit that subscribe button and join us to uncover this heart-wrenching mystery. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. The wind howled through the Colorado Rockies, clawing at the edges of Pine Ridge Hospital as Dr. James Carter stumbled out of the trauma ward, his scrubs clinging to his sweat-soaked skin after a grueling 14-hour shift. It was past midnight, and the parking lot lay silent under a thin shroud of snow, the sodium lights buzzing faintly like dying fireflies. He pulled his coat tighter, his breath puffing into clouds that dissolved into the bitter cold, when something stopped him dead in his tracks. A pair of glowing amber eyes, sharp as twin flames staring from the shadows near the hospital's front entrance. There, huddled against the frost-dusted stone wall, sat a bobcat kitten, its tufted ears twitching, its spotted coat barely thicker than a whisper against the winter's bite. James blinked, his exhaustion momentarily replaced by a jolt of curiosity. Wild animals weren't rare in Pine Ridge, the town nestled deep in the foothills, where deer and coyotes roamed as freely as the wind. But this was different. The kitten didn't bolt or hiss, it just sat there, motionless, its gaze locked on the glass doors as if expecting someone to step through them. "Hey, little guy," James murmured, his voice soft as he crouched a safe distance away, fishing a half-eaten granola bar from his pocket. He broke off a piece and tossed it onto the snow between them, watching as the kitten sniffed it cautiously before nibbling with delicate precision, then returned to its post like a sentinel carved from ice. Night after night, James found it there, a tiny silhouette beneath the hospital lights, its presence as constant as the snow that kept falling. He started calling it Shadow, not for its dark fur, but for the way it seemed to cling to some unseen memory, a ghost it wouldn't let go. He brought scraps from his lunch, a cup of water one evening, even a small tarp to shield it from the wind, always keeping his distance to avoid spooking it. But the more he watched, the more questions gnawed at him. Why here? Why the hospital? It wasn't lost or starving, not entirely. It was waiting. And that deliberate stillness stirred something deep in James, a mix of awe and unease he couldn't shake. The mystery took a darker turn on the 5th night. James stepped out after a chaotic shift. 3 car crash victims, 2 flat lines, and a kid who'd barely made it, and the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the promise of a storm. As he approached the entrance, a sharp crack split the silence, a sound he knew too well from his years in trauma. A gunshot. His heart lurched and he sprinted toward Shadow's usual spot, boots crunching through the snow. The tarp lay crumpled, a smear of crimson staining the white beneath it, but Shadow was gone. Panic clawed at his chest as he scanned the darkness, the wind swallowing his calls. "Shadow, where are you?" No tracks, no body, just that haunting splash of blood, bright as a warning against the frost. The next morning, whispers buzzed through the hospital corridors. A janitor swore he'd seen a bobcat kitten limping near the dumpster at dawn, alive but shaken. A nurse claimed it was a guardian spirit watching over the dying souls inside. But out in town, a different story brewed. Hank Grayson, a grizzled hunter with a chipped tooth and a rifle slung over his shoulder, had been overheard at the diner growling about a damn bobcat threatening his livestock. Seen it sniffing around the hospital, he'd snarled, tapping his gun. "Next time it won't get away." James overheard this from a patient's family and his stomach twisted. Was Hank the one who'd fired that shot? Had he been stalking Shadow all along? James didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear. Shadow wasn't just some stray. Its vigil wasn't random. It was rooted in something bigger, something tied to those glass doors it stared at night after night. He couldn't explain it, not yet, but he felt it in his bones, the same way he'd felt a pulse flicker back to life under his hands in the ER. As he stood in the parking lot that evening, the snow falling thicker now, he made a silent promise to find out why, to protect this fragile, wild thing that had somehow chosen him. What was Shadow waiting for? Who had pulled that trigger? And why did James feel like he was being pulled into a story he hadn't signed up for? One thing was certain, the answers were out there, buried in the snow, and he wouldn't stop until he dug them up. The storm hit Pine Ridge like a fist, snow slashing sideways across the hospital parking lot as Dr. James Carter hunched against the wind, his flashlight cutting through the swirling white. That gunshot from the night before echoed in his skull, a relentless drumbeat driving him out into the freezing dark to find Shadow. The blood on the snow, vivid, accusing, had seared itself into his mind, and now, with every gust tearing at his coat, he felt the weight of something he couldn't name. Fear, yes, but also a stubborn flicker of hope. He swept the beam across the dumpster, the bushes, the shadowed corners where the Bobcat kitten might have fled, his voice hoarse as he called, "Shadow, come on, buddy, where are you?" A rustle snapped his head to the left, and there, beneath a tangle of icy thorns, he saw it. Those amber eyes glinting like lanterns in the gloom. Shadow was alive, but barely. The kitten's left hind leg dragged uselessly, a jagged tear, oozing red where a bullet had grazed it, matting its fur with frost and blood. James's breath caught, his doctor's instincts kicking in even as his rational mind screamed to stay back. A wounded wild animal could lash out, and those needle-sharp claws weren't toys. But as Shadow's gaze met his, steady despite the pain, something softened in James. He shrugged off his coat, ripping the sleeve into a makeshift bandage, and edged closer, hands trembling. "Easy, little guy," he whispered, wrapping the fabric around the wound as Shadow growled low, a warning, not a threat. Then went still, letting him finish. He couldn't leave it there, not in this storm, not with Hank Grayson's rifle out there somewhere. James scooped Shadow up, cradling it against his chest, and stumbled back toward the hospital's service entrance, the kitten's warmth seeping through his scrubs like a fragile heartbeat. He found a quiet corner near the boiler room, setting Shadow down with a tarp and a bowl of water, promising himself he'd figure out the rest later. But later came too soon. At dawn, as he clocked out, the hospital's head administrator cornered him in the break room, her voice clipped. "Carter, we've had complaints, patients spooked, staff whispering about a Bobcat problem. If you're feeding that thing, it stops now or you're on suspension, understood?" James nodded, jaw tight, but inside he burned. Suspension meant losing his license, his life's work, yet letting Shadow die felt like abandoning a patient. That evening, as he slipped out with a bag of cat food tucked under his arm, fate threw him a lifeline, or a noose. A woman stood near Shadow's spot, her silver hair whipping in the wind, her eyes locked on the kitten as it lapped at the water he'd left. "You're the one looking after Ethan's little Shadow," she said, her voice raspy but warm, catching James off guard. He frowned. "Ethan?" She introduced herself as Ruth Callahan, a neighbor from up the ridge, and gestured toward the hospital doors. "Ethan Caldwell? Wildlife biologist, loner, my friend. He died here a month ago. Pancreatic cancer. That Bobcat was his. Found it half dead after a storm last spring, raised it like his own kid." James's pulse quickened as Ruth's words sank in. Shadow wasn't just waiting. It was waiting for someone. Ruth led him to Ethan's cabin that night, a weathered shack perched among the pines, its porch sagging under years of neglect. Inside, dust-coated shelves lined with books on bobcats and wilderness survival, and on the kitchen table sat a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and cramped with Ethan's tight scrawl. James flipped it open, his eyes catching on a passage. Shadows growing fast, hunting instincts kicking in. "I've trained him for the wild, but the hunters around here won't let him go. Hank Grayson threatened me last week, said he'd shoot him if I didn't hand him over. I'd keep him forever if I could, but freedom's his right, not mine." A second find stopped James cold. a crumpled letter addressed to the Colorado Wildlife Association, never mailed. "I'm dying," Ethan had written, "and Shadow's not ready. Please help him before they kill him." Ruth's voice broke as she watched James read. Ethan was terrified for that kitten, said it gave him purpose when the cancer ate everything else away. James stared at Shadow, now curled under the tarp, and felt a chill deeper than the storm outside. Had Hank fired that shot? Was Shadow's vigil a death sentence? The snow had stopped falling, but a restless quiet settled over Pine Ridge Hospital as Dr. James Carter knelt beside Shadow in the dim glow of the boiler room, the Bobcat kitten's bandaged leg trembling with each shallow breath. He'd called in a favor. Dr. Claire Nguyen, a wildlife vet with a no-nonsense streak and a soft spot for orphaned phalids. She arrived at dusk, her telephoto lens trained on Shadow from a safe distance, her verdict crisp over the phone. "He's tough. Good muscle tone, not too tame. With care he can make it back to the wild." James exhaled, relief warring with the gnawing dread that had rooted in his gut since Ruth's story. Ethan Caldwell had wanted Shadow free, but freedom came with a price, and Hank Grayson's shadow loomed larger every day. Claire's plan was meticulous: stabilize Shadow's wound, then relocate him to a release site Ethan had mapped out in his journal, a protected valley 20 miles north. James spent his lunch breaks studying those pages, Ethan's words painting a picture of a man who'd loved the wild enough to let it go. But love wasn't enough. Not when Hank's truck rumbled past the hospital that evening, its headlights slicing through the dusk like a predator's eyes. James caught a glimpse of the rifle rack in the back, and his stomach dropped. He'd heard the rumors, Hank blaming Shadow for a missing calf, swearing to end it, and now the hunter's patience was fraying. The confrontation came faster than James expected. He and Claire were loading Shadow's crate into his Jeep after midnight, the kittens sedated for the move, when gravel crunched behind them. Hank Grayson stepped from the darkness, flanked by two roughnecks, his voice a low growl. "That cat's mine to finish, Doc. Hand it over, or we do this the hard way." James froze, the crate's handle biting into his palm, but Claire squared her shoulders, her calm masking steel. "It's a wild animal, not your trophy. Back off." Hank sneered, pulling a handgun from his coat, the barrel glinting under the parking lot lights. "You don't get it. Ethan coddled that thing, and now it's a menace. Move." Before James could react, a figure burst from the hospital side door. Nurse Emily Brooks, her blonde braids swinging, a baseball bat gripped tight in her hands. "Touch them, and I'm calling the cops, Hank," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Hank's eyes narrowed, but Emily held her ground, phone already dialing. The standoff stretched taut as a wire, seconds bleeding into eternity, until Hank spat into the snow and backed off, his parting shot chilling James to the bone. "That cat's dead, even if I rot for it." The truck roared away, leaving silence and the faint smell of diesel in its wake. Shaken, James retreated to the break room with Ethan's journal, seeking answers in the chaos. He flipped past the training logs, Shadow pouncing on squirrels, climbing trees, until a later entry stopped him cold. "Pain's worse today. Docs say it's pancreatic cancer, spread too fast. I think it's the runoff Pine Timber Co. dumped something upriver years back. Shadow was born near that creek. If it got me, did it get him too?" James's hands shook as he reread it, Ethan's suspicions sinking like a stone. A chemical poison? He grabbed a sample of Shadow's fur from Claire's kit and sent it to a lab friend in Denver, begging for a rush job. The results came 2 days later, a call that hit like a punch. Traces of an industrial toxin, banned but persistent, lodged in Shadow's system. "It's low level," the tech said, "but chronic exposure could shorten his life. Months, maybe years off." James slumped against the wall, the phone slipping in his hand. Ethan had been right. Pine Timber Co. might have killed him, and now Shadow carried the same silent death sentence. Claire's voice cut through his haze when he told her, "We can still release him. He's not symptomatic yet. But it's your call, James, wild and short or caged and safe." The hospital's ultimatum loomed: quit meddling or lose everything. Hank's threat echoed. And now this, a poisoned bobcat, a dead man's dream, and a company that might have murdered them both. James stared at Shadow's crate, the kitten's amber eyes flickering open, and felt the weight of a choice he couldn't unmake. Was Ethan's plan a gift or a curse? Had Pine Timber Co. buried more than chemicals in these mountains? The dawn broke cold and brittle over Pine Ridge, the sky a bruised gray as Dr. James Carter gripped the steering wheel of his Jeep, Shadow's crate rattling softly in the back. Dr. Claire Nguyen sat beside him, her jaw set, while Nurse Emily Brooks followed in her pickup, a makeshift convoy racing against time. They'd settled on Ethan Caldwell's release site, a hidden valley of pine and stone, marked in his journal as Shadow's birthright. But first, James insisted on one stop. "Ethan deserves to say goodbye," he'd told Claire, his voice cracking as he pictured Ethan's final days, alone in that hospital bed, whispering Shadow's name. She'd nodded, reluctant but understanding, and now they turned off the highway toward Pine Ridge Cemetery, the weight of the past pressing down like the snow-heavy branches overhead. James knelt by Ethan's grave, a simple slab etched with faded letters, and set Shadow's crate beside it, sliding open a viewing panel. The bobcat kitten stirred, its amber eyes blinking against the light, nose twitching as it scented the frost-kissed earth. "Here he is, Ethan," James murmured, feeling foolish but compelled. "I found your plan. We're taking him where you wanted." A rustle broke his reverie. Dr. Rajesh Patel, Ethan's oncologist, stepped from the trees, a bouquet of winter greens in his hands, his face etched with quiet grief. "I visit when I can," Rajesh said, voice thick. "Ethan was my patient, spoke of that kitten like it was his soul, cried once, not for himself, but because he'd never see it free." He placed a wooden bobcat carving on the stone, its lines worn smooth by Ethan's dying hands. "He carved this in chemo, said it kept him sane." James's throat tightened, tears stinging as Rajesh's words sank in. Ethan's love, Shadow's vigil, a bond unbroken by death. He could almost see it, Ethan staring out his hospital window, willing Shadow to feel him one last time. But peace shattered like glass when a truck roared up the cemetery lane. Hank Grayson, eyes wild, rifle in hand, flanked by his crew. "Thought you sneak off, Doc," Hank snarled, leveling the barrel at the crate. "That cat's mine." Claire lunged forward, shouting, "You're insane, this ends now." But Hank's finger twitched on the trigger, and time slowed to a heartbeat. James didn't think, he acted. He threw himself in front of Shadow's crate, arms spread wide, as the gunshot cracked through the stillness. Pain exploded in his shoulder, a white-hot lance that dropped him to his knees, blood soaking his coat and pooling on the snow. "Run!" he gasped, clawing at the crate's latch with his good hand, freeing Shadow as Claire and Emily screamed. The kitten bolted, a blur of spotted fur vanishing into the trees, while Emily tackled Hank's legs, her bat swinging. Sirens wailed. Emily's 911 call from the Jeep had paid off, and deputies swarmed in, pinning Hank to the ground as he cursed, his rifle skittering across the ice. James slumped against Ethan's grave, vision blurring, Shadow's escape replaying in his mind. A wild thing finally free, just as Ethan had dreamed. Rajesh knelt beside him, pressing his scarf to the wound, tears streaming down his face. "You did it, James. Ethan would have been proud." Claire dragged the first aid kit from the Jeep, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "Hold on, damn it. He's safe because of you." Emily sobbed, clutching James's hand, her bravery crumbling now that the fight was over. Through the haze, James saw Shadow's eyes one last time, peering from the tree line, steady and knowing before they faded into the wilderness. He'd saved Shadow, but at what cost? His shoulder throbbed, his career hung by a thread, and the toxin in Shadow's blood haunted him. Freedom might kill it yet. Rajesh's voice broke through, soft and reverent. "Ethan faced death with grace because of that bobcat. You gave him his ending." James choked on a sob. the carving's edges digging into his palm as he clutched it, a lifeline between two men who'd never met and the creature that bound them. Had Shadow understood? Had it felt Ethan in that fleeting glance? Hank's arrest offered cold comfort. The real battle was just beginning. Pine Timber Co's shadow loomed, and Shadow's fate hung in the balance, but for now, James let the pain pull him under, clinging to one truth: he'd kept a promise. The hospital lights faded behind Dr. James Carter as he rolled his wheelchair across the hardwood floor of Ethan Caldwell's cabin, the faint creak of the wheels blending with the wind rattling the pines outside. 3 weeks had passed since that blood-soaked morning at the cemetery, and the bullet wound in his shoulder still burned, a jagged scar stitching his flesh back together, a permanent mark of the day he'd thrown himself between Shadow and Hank Grayson's rifle. He'd survived, but the cost was steep. A 6-month medical leave, his career teetering on the edge, and nights haunted by the echo of that gunshot. Yet, as he gazed out the frost-rimmed window at the mountains beyond, a quiet peace settled over him, fragile but real. Dr. Claire Wynn's email had arrived that morning, a lifeline in the fog of recovery. Attached were grainy photos from a wildlife camera, Shadow, lean and alert, stalking through the valley Ethan had chosen, his spotted coat thicker now against the winter chill. One shot caught him mid-pounce, jaws clamped around a rabbit, the scar on his hind leg a faint shadow of that near-fatal graze. "He's thriving," Claire wrote, "hunting like he was born for it. The toxin's there, but no signs of decline yet. Could be years before it matters, if ever." James traced the image with a trembling finger, tears blurring the screen. Shadow was free, wild, exactly as Ethan had dreamed. A testament to a promise kept across the divide of death. But freedom wasn't the end of the story. A second letter arrived that week, this one from an environmental group in Denver. "Preliminary tests match the toxin in your Bobcat to Pine Timber Co's old dumping sites," it read. "We're filing a class action suit. Ethan Caldwell's name is on it. Justice might be slow, but it's coming." James clutched the paper, his heart pounding. Ethan's hunch, scribbled in that journal as cancer ate him alive, had been right. The company that poisoned a creek, a man, and a bobcat might finally pay. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a spark. A chance to turn loss into something bigger. He'd bought Ethan's cabin on impulse, draining his savings to keep it from the developers circling like vultures. Nurse Emily Brooks had helped, rallying a small fund from hospital staff who'd followed Shadow's tail, whispering about the Bobcat doc who'd risked it all. Now, James sat there daily, a guardian of the land Ethan had loved, watching the forest reclaim what was hers. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting golden streaks through the trees, he saw a second bobcat kitten, smaller, skittish, sniffing near the porch. James held his breath, wondering, was it Shadow's kin? A mate? A sign that life against all odds would go on? He smiled, the first real one in weeks, and let the hope bloom. Dr. Rajesh Patel visited the next day, bringing a small plaque for Ethan's grave. "Friend of the wild, fighter for justice." They drove to the cemetery together, Rajesh steadying James as he limped to the stone. "You gave him this," Rajesh said, voice soft, placing the plaque beside the wooden bobcat carving. "And you gave me a reason to keep going too. Patients like Ethan stick with you." James nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Emily joined them later, her eyes red but bright, announcing a wildlife fund in Shadow's name. "We've got $5,000 already," she grinned. "You started something, James." Hank Grayson's trial loomed on the horizon. Assault with a deadly weapon, a plea deal in the works, but James barely cared. The real victory was out there, in that valley where Shadow roamed, and here, in the cabin where Ethan's spirit lingered. He kept the wildlife photo on his desk, a daily reminder of the chain of care. Ethan's compassion, his own sacrifice, Claire's expertise, Emily's courage, Rajesh's faith. It had carried them through the dark, and now it lit the way forward. As spring crept closer, James wheeled outside one evening, the air sharp with pine and promise. He thought of Shadow, of Ethan, of the fight still ahead against Pine Timber Co. Then he saw it again. That second kitten, bolder now, darting across the clearing. Maybe Shadow wasn't alone. Maybe the wild would heal what men had broken. James wiped his eyes, the ache in his shoulder easing just a little, and whispered, "Keep running, buddy." Will Shadow's legacy outlast the toxin? Was James right to buy the cabin, or should he let nature be? Share your thoughts below and subscribe. Let's hit 1,000 subscribers and see where this journey takes us next.